I never imagined that the small patch of earth behind my home would become the center of a war. My garden wasn't just soil and seeds. It was my sanctuary, my therapy after years of struggling through loss and stress. Every petal I planted carried a piece of my healing. But to the HOA, it was nothing more than a violation. It started with a letter in my mailbox. A formal notice with bold red ink stamped across the top. Citation, non-compliant landscaping. I thought there had to be some mistake. My garden wasn't messy or neglected. It was thriving with life. But the HOA board saw it differently. They claimed my non-standard plants and wooden garden beds didn't fit their uniform neighborhood aesthetic. To them, the rows of herbs, tomatoes, and flowers that I'd nurtured with care were unsightly structures. I stood in my backyard that day, reading their letter, my hands trembling with disbelief. This wasn't just about rules, it felt personal. My late mother taught me how to grow vegetables, how to treat every seed like a promise. Gardening connected me to her. Losing that connection felt like losing her all over again. But I wasn't ready to give up. I sent an appeal to the HOA, explaining that my garden wasn't a hobby, it was a lifeline. I attached photos showing it was clean, well-maintained, and even beautiful. Weeks later, I received their reply, a short, cold email saying, "Your request is denied. Remove the garden within 10 days or face daily fines." That night, I sat on my porch and looked over the rows of green life swaying in the soft breeze. I couldn't tear it down. Every plant had a story. The lavender that helped me sleep after my mother's passing. The mint that my daughter used for her lemonade stand. The tomatoes my wife and I planted together every spring. They weren't violations. They were memories. I never imagined that the small patch of earth behind my home would become the center of a war. My garden wasn't just soil and seeds. It was my sanctuary, my therapy after years of struggling through loss and stress. Every petal I planted carried a piece of my healing. But to the HOA, it was nothing more than a violation. It started with a letter in my mailbox. A formal notice with bold red ink stamped across the top. Citation, non-compliant landscaping. I thought there had to be some mistake. My garden wasn't messy or neglected. It was thriving with life. But the HOA board saw it differently. They claimed my non-standard plants and wooden garden beds didn't fit their uniform neighborhood aesthetic. To them, the rows of herbs, tomatoes, and flowers that I'd nurtured with care were unsightly structures. I stood in my backyard that day, reading their letter, my hands trembling with disbelief. This wasn't just about rules, it felt personal. My late mother taught me how to grow vegetables, how to treat every seed like a promise. Gardening connected me to her. Losing that connection felt like losing her all over again. But I wasn't ready to give up. I sent an appeal to the HOA, explaining that my garden wasn't a hobby, it was a lifeline. I attached photos showing it was clean, well-maintained, and even beautiful. Weeks later, I received their reply, a short, cold email saying, "Your request is denied. Remove the garden within 10 days or face daily fines." That night, I sat on my porch and looked over the rows of green life swaying in the soft breeze. I couldn't tear it down. Every plant had a story. The lavender that helped me sleep after my mother's passing. The mint that my daughter used for her lemonade stand. The tomatoes my wife and I planted together every spring. They weren't violations. They were memories. My stomach dropped. Aline meant they could come after my home. All because I refused to dig up some basil and tomatoes. I could almost hear my mother's voice in my head saying, "Don't let them take what you've worked for." I held that letter so tightly it crumpled in my hand. I wasn't just angry, I was heartbroken. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my wife, Sarah. Her eyes were tired, her voice soft but steady. "Maybe it's time we think about moving," she whispered. The words cut through me. "Move?" I asked, trying to hide the pain in my voice. "Because I planted food in our own backyard?" She didn't answer. She just reached for my hand, and I could feel her fear. We built our lives here, every brick, every memory. I wasn't ready to walk away. The next few weeks were a blur of letters, emails, and warnings. The HOA board's tone grew sharper with each message. They accused me of defiance, of lowering neighborhood property values. They even cited bylaws that, according to them, prohibited visible cultivation. But I noticed something. Those bylaws were vague. They mentioned ornamental consistency, but never once defined it. It was all interpretation, all control. That realization lit a fire inside me. I decided to take the fight to them, not with anger, but with knowledge. I started attending HOA meetings, sitting quietly in the back as they discussed neighborhood landscaping, paint colors, and fence heights. When my case came up, I stood and spoke calmly. I explained how my garden was neat, sustainable, and in no way a nuisance. I even offered to plant community flowers along the border to make it blend in. The room was silent for a moment, then one board member, Mr. Graham, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "This isn't a farm, Mr. Khan," he said mockingly. "It's a neighborhood. We don't need a farmer bringing down our property image." His words were met with a few quiet chuckles. My face flushed with humiliation, but I stood my ground. "You may not need it," I replied, "but some of us need something real to grow, something that gives us peace." After that meeting, I knew reasoning wouldn't work. This wasn't about beauty or rules. It was about control. I walked home that night under the dim streetlights, clutching my folder of documents, and I made myself a promise. If they wanted a fight, they'd get one, but I'd fight smart. The next morning, I contacted a local attorney who specialized in land use law. Her name was Emma Patel, a calm, confident woman who had the kind of presence that made you feel instantly at ease. I explained my situation and handed her the stack of letters. She flipped through them, raised an eyebrow, and said something I'll never forget. "They don't own your land. They only think they do." Emma explained that under my state's Right to Farm Act, small-scale gardening for personal use or limited sale was protected, even in residential zones, as long as it didn't create a public nuisance. "You're growing food, not running a factory," she said. "They can't fine you for that." For the first time in months, I felt a wave of relief. But Emma warned me that HOAs often rely on intimidation. "They'll try to drag you down with paperwork and threats," she said. "They expect you to give up before it gets to court. Don't let them." So I didn't. I kept gardening. I weeded every row, trimmed every edge, and made sure not a single leaf looked out of place. My garden became a symbol of quiet rebellion, every bloom a statement of resilience. But the HOA wasn't backing down. One morning, I noticed a white SUV idling across the street. A man inside was taking photos, zooming in on my yard. When I confronted him, he said he was with the HOA's Compliance Committee. I asked him why he needed pictures. He shrugged and said, "Just documentation." It felt invasive, almost like being watched in my own home. That evening, another letter arrived, this time citing continued non-compliance with escalating fines. They had increased it to $500 a week. I laughed in disbelief. It wasn't funny, but sometimes when life gets absurd, laughter is all you have left. I pinned the notice to my refrigerator like a war trophy. Still, the pressure was relentless. Some neighbors started avoiding eye contact. Others whispered that I was making things worse for everyone. I felt isolated, even from people I once called friends. But late at night, when the world was quiet, I'd walk out into the moonlit garden, run my fingers through the lavender, and remind myself why I started. It wasn't about money, pride, or power. It was about peace, something the HOA could never understand. Emma and I began preparing a formal response. We drafted a letter invoking my right to farm protections, complete with citations, case references, and photos of the garden's condition. When I handed it to the HOA board during their next meeting, they looked stunned. They weren't expecting resistance backed by law. Mr. Graham took the paper, glanced at it, and said, "We'll review this." His voice was dripping with condescension, but I caught something in his eyes, uncertainty. They weren't invincible, and he knew it. That night, for the first time in months, I slept peacefully. My fight had finally begun to take shape. The garden that had once been my therapy had now become my battlefield, and I was ready to defend it. The calm that followed my legal response didn't last long. For about a week, I heard nothing from the HOA. No letters, no emails, no calls. It was almost peaceful, until I woke up one morning to find a bright orange tag nailed to my front fence. It read, in bold letters, "Final warning, legal action pending." My hand shook as I tore it down. They weren't backing off. They were just gathering ammunition. Later that afternoon, I saw 2 HOA representatives walking along the side of my house, snapping photos and measuring the garden beds. When I stepped outside to ask what they were doing, one of them, a man with a clipboard and mirrored sunglasses, simply said, "Documenting violations." He didn't even look me in the eye. I could feel anger bubbling inside me, but I knew losing my temper would only give them what they wanted. I called Emma immediately, explaining what had happened. She sighed and said, "They're trying to intimidate you. Don't react. Just document everything." So that's exactly what I did. I started keeping a journal of every encounter, every letter, every visit. I even installed a small camera on my porch to capture any activity near my property. If they wanted a battle, I'd meet them on every front. A few days later, the HOA held another public meeting. I knew my case would come up, so I went, even though every part of me dreaded it. As I entered the room, I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me. Whispers rippled across the chairs. Some faces showed sympathy, but most just stared with judgment. The president, Mr. Graham, cleared his throat and began reading from a prepared statement. "Due to continued noncompliance," he announced, "the board has voted to initiate legal proceedings against Mr. Khan for repeated violations of neighborhood aesthetic standards." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. Legal proceedings. They were really doing it. I stood slowly, my voice shaking but firm. "You're fighting me for growing food. You're suing me for planting life. Do you hear how absurd that sounds?" Mr. Graham smirked. "This isn't about food, Mr. Khan. It's about rules. You chose to live here, and with that comes responsibility." His words dripped with arrogance. I wanted to shout that I had every right to live in peace, but instead, I took a deep breath and said, "And with home ownership comes freedom. You've forgotten that part." The room went silent. I gathered my papers and left. Outside, under the cold night sky, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and strength. They had declared war, but I was no longer afraid. Every step they took against me only strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about a garden anymore. It was about standing up to a system that crushed individuality. Over the next month, the fines continued to pile up. $500 became $1,000, then $1,500. They claimed they'd add the amount to my property dues and file a lien if unpaid. I watched the numbers grow like weeds, but I didn't pay a single cent. Instead, I focused on what mattered: the soil, the plants, and the evidence. I knew the law was on my side. But the stress began to take a toll. I stopped sleeping well. My wife tried to comfort me, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "What if they really take us to court?" she asked one evening as we sat on the porch. I looked out at the garden glowing in the sunset and said quietly, "Then we'll let the truth speak for us." One morning, I came home from work to find a bright pink notice taped to my door, a summons. The HOA had officially filed a lawsuit. My chest tightened as I read it. They accused me of breach of community covenant, property devaluation, and failure to comply with board orders. Each line felt heavier than the last. I sat on the steps, the paper trembling in my hands. All of this, for a few rows of vegetables. That night I couldn't eat. I walked through the garden, touching each plant like it might be the last time. The lavender scent calmed me slightly, but the weight of what lay ahead felt crushing. I thought about giving up. I really did. But then, I remembered my mother's voice, the one that always guided me when I was lost. "The ground always gives back what you give it: patience, care, and courage." The next morning, I called Emma and told her I was ready to fight. She met me at her office and began building our defense. We gathered photos, emails, and every fine notice they'd sent. she prepared to invoke the Right to Farm Act in full force. "They think they can intimidate you with bureaucracy," she said. "But the law protects you more than they realize." As the court date approached, the HOA tried one last tactic: humiliation. They sent out a community newsletter with a section titled, "Maintaining Our Neighborhood Image." Without naming me directly, it described certain residents who continue to disregard community standards and harm property values. They even included a blurred photo of my garden. Everyone knew who they were talking about. When I saw it, my heart sank. I'd never felt so exposed, so unwanted in my own neighborhood. That night, as I watered the garden, my neighbor Mrs. Lewis, an elderly woman who had lived there for decades, walked over quietly. She handed me a small basket of lemons from her yard and said, "Don't let them scare you, dear. What you're doing is good. My husband and I used to grow food too, until they made us stop." Her kindness brought tears to my eyes. Her words reminded me that I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for every person who had ever been told that following their passion, their peace, wasn't allowed because it didn't fit in. The HOA could find me, threaten me, even try to shame me, but they couldn't control the truth. And as the court date drew near, I realized something powerful. I wasn't the one on trial anymore. They were. The day of the hearing arrived like a storm that had been building for months. The air was heavy, and my heart raced as I stood outside the courthouse with my attorney, Emma. I'd barely slept the night before. Every sound, every memory of the letters, every word from the HOA echoed in my head. It all led to this moment, a chance to defend not just my garden, but my right to live freely. Inside, the courtroom felt cold and sterile. The HOA board sat together at one table, their suits crisp, their faces unreadable. Mr. Graham, their president, avoided eye contact but wore a faint smirk, as if he already knew the outcome. I took my seat beside Emma, clutching my notes like they were a lifeline. She leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. We've got this." When the judge entered, the room went silent. He began reviewing the documents in front of him, his glasses perched low on his nose. The HOA's attorney was the first to speak. His voice was confident, rehearsed. He painted a picture of me as a stubborn homeowner who refused to respect community order. He spoke about uniformity and aesthetic harmony. When it was our turn, Emma stood and began with quiet authority. "Your Honor," she said, "my client's so-called violations are nothing more than a garden that provides food for his family and causes no harm to anyone. The HOA's actions are not about maintaining standards. They're about control." Her voice didn't waver once. I sat there, amazed at how fearlessly she spoke for me. The judge listened carefully, occasionally glancing toward me. Emma continued, pulling out photographs of the garden, neatly arranged rows, trimmed edges, blooming flowers. "This is not an eyesore," she said firmly. "This is a symbol of peace, sustainability, and life." Then she held up the final document, a printed copy of the Right to Farm Act. "And this," she added, "is the law that protects it." The HOA's attorney shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor," he argued, "this statute pertains to agricultural land, not residential communities." But Emma was ready. "That's where you're wrong," she replied, pointing to a section of the law. "This state recognizes small-scale, non-commercial gardening as a protected form of agricultural activity as long as it poses no nuisance. My client meets every condition." The judge nodded slightly, making notes. I could feel a flicker of hope ignite inside me. But Mr. Graham wasn't finished. He suddenly stood, asking permission to speak. "Your Honor," he said, "if we allow this, it sets a dangerous precedent. What's next? Chickens in every yard? Compost piles on every street?" His words dripped with fearmongering. "We have to maintain standards." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Graham," he said evenly, "standards do not override state law, nor do they erase personal rights." The silence that followed was thick. Mr. Graham sat down slowly, his confidence slipping for the first time since this ordeal began. Then Emma turned to me and nodded. "Tell the court why this garden matters to you." she said softly. My throat tightened, but I stood. My voice trembled as I spoke. Your Honor, I started this garden after my mother passed away. She taught me how to grow life from the ground, to turn grief into growth. It's more than a hobby. It's how I heal. It's how I live. I paused, my eyes burning. I've never broken a law, never caused harm. I only wanted to grow something beautiful, something good. But they fined me, threatened me, humiliated me. All because I refused to conform to their image of perfection. I looked directly at the HOA table. I'm not their enemy. I'm just a man trying to keep a piece of peace alive. The courtroom was silent. Even the HOA's lawyer looked down, pretending to read his papers. The judge leaned back, deep in thought. After a long pause, he said, Thank you, Mr. Khan. That was powerful. Then he turned to both sides and announced a short recess. I stepped outside, my heart pounding. Emma smiled slightly. You did perfect, she said. You reminded him this isn't about rules. It's about humanity. When court resumed, the judge delivered his remarks. This case, he began, is a perfect example of when power meets principle. Homeowners associations exist to maintain order, not to suffocate individuality. He glanced toward the HOA's table. Your board's interpretation of aesthetic standards oversteps its legal boundaries. Then, turning to me, he continued, Mr. Khan, the Right to Farm Act clearly applies in your case. You are lawfully within your rights to maintain your garden for personal and family use. My chest tightened. He wasn't finished. Therefore, all fines imposed by the HOA are nullified, and the board is prohibited from issuing further penalties related to this matter. The words hit me like sunlight after a storm. My knees went weak with relief. I looked at Emma, and she smiled, not a victorious smile, but a proud, quiet one. The kind that said, you did it. Mr. Graham, meanwhile, sat frozen, his face pale. The other board members whispered nervously among themselves. But the judge wasn't done. Furthermore, he added, this court recommends the HOA review its policies to ensure they align with state law and basic homeowner rights. It wasn't just a win, it was a message. A message that they couldn't control everything. As we left the courthouse, reporters who'd caught wind of the case snapped photos and asked questions. I didn't say much, I was too overwhelmed. But I did say one thing that made it into the local paper the next day. I didn't win for myself. I won for everyone who just wants to live in peace. That evening, I returned home and stood in my garden, watching the sunset bathe everything in gold. The air smelled of mint and lavender, and for the first time in months, it didn't smell like fear. The fines were gone. The threats were gone. All that remained was the quiet rustle of leaves, the sound of freedom. The morning after the court ruling, I woke to the sound of birds singing outside my window. For months, I'd been waking up to anxiety, wondering what new letter or fine would show up. But that morning, it was different. The world felt lighter. The fear that had haunted me was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. I stepped outside barefoot, feeling the cool earth beneath my feet, and whispered, We did it, Mom. My garden shimmered with dew in the golden sunrise. Every leaf seemed to stand taller. Every flower seemed brighter, like they, too, were celebrating the freedom we'd fought for. I watered the plants slowly, taking my time, letting every moment sink in. For the first time in so long, I didn't feel like I was breaking a rule. I felt like I belonged here again. But as much as I wanted to leave the battle behind, the storm wasn't completely over. Later that day, a letter from the HOA appeared in my mailbox. My heart skipped for a second, but when I opened it, I almost laughed. It wasn't a fine or a threat. It was a statement of compliance. They were forced to acknowledge that my garden was now officially approved under revised guidelines. It was their way of surrendering without saying the word. Word about the court case spread quickly. Some neighbors I barely knew stopped by to congratulate me. You stood up for all of us, one man said. I wanted to build a greenhouse, but I was too afraid. Another woman brought over cookies and whispered, I wish I had your courage. It felt surreal. The same people who once avoided eye contact were now thanking me. I realized how many of them had been silently suffering under the HOA's rigid control. Still, not everyone was happy. A few board members gave me cold stares whenever I drove by. Mr. Graham, especially, couldn't hide his resentment. One afternoon, I saw him trimming his perfectly manicured hedge across the street, pretending not to notice me. But the look in his eyes told me everything. He wasn't used to losing. And now, he had to live with the fact that the person he tried to crush had beaten him fair and square. That night, as I sat with Sarah on the porch, she leaned against my shoulder and said softly, "You did it. You really did it." I smiled and looked out over the garden. "We did it," I said. "All of us." For months, I had been fueled by anger and fear, but now it was something deeper, gratitude. Gratitude for the soil, the struggle, and the small victories that grow into something greater. A few days later, the local newspaper published an article about the case. The headline read, "Homeowner wins landmark case against HOA using Right to Farm Act." It described the situation in detail, how one homeowner's persistence had forced a change in HOA policies. The article spread quickly online, and messages began pouring in from people across the state. Farmers, gardeners, even teachers wrote to thank me for standing up. One message stood out from the rest. It was from a young man who wrote, "My mom used to garden before our HOA shut her down. She gave up after they fined her. But after reading your story, she's planting again." I read it over and over until tears blurred the words. I realized that this fight had grown beyond my backyard. It had planted seeds of courage in others. But life has a way of testing even the strongest spirits. A week later, the HOA held a special meeting to discuss future neighborhood compliance strategies. It was their attempt to save face, to show they still had control. I decided to attend, not to fight, but to listen. When I walked in, the room went quiet. Mr. Graham avoided my gaze, but other members greeted me respectfully. Something had changed. Fear had shifted sides. They discussed new landscaping guidelines that would embrace diversity while maintaining harmony. It was clearly inspired by my case. When the floor opened for comments, I stood up. My voice was calm, steady. "I'm glad we're moving forward," I said. "But let's not forget, rules should protect, not punish. A community isn't about uniformity. It's about people." The room was silent, but this time, it wasn't out of hostility. It was reflection. Even some board members nodded slightly. When the meeting ended, Mrs. Lewis, the kind elderly neighbor who'd once given me lemons, smiled and said, "You didn't just win your garden back. You gave us all a little freedom." Her words warmed my heart more than any court victory ever could. Over the next few weeks, something beautiful began to happen. Neighbors started planting again. One house added a small herb patch near their porch. Another family built a butterfly garden in their front yard. Slowly, color returned to our neighborhood, not the kind painted on houses, but the kind that grows from the earth. The HOA's grip had loosened, replaced by a quiet sense of pride. And yet, despite all the change, I still felt a lingering sadness when I walked past my mailbox, the same place where this entire nightmare had begun. I remembered the fear, the sleepless nights, the humiliation. But I also remembered the strength it revealed in me. Sometimes, peace isn't something you're given. Sometimes, it's something you have to fight for, plant by plant, inch by inch. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat in the garden surrounded by the scent of mint and soil. Fireflies danced above the flowers, and the world felt still. I whispered a quiet promise to myself. Never again will I let fear uproot what I've grown. Months passed, and life slowly began to return to normal, or at least a new version of it. The garden that once stood as a symbol of defiance had now become a place of calm again. Every morning, I'd step outside with a cup of tea and feel the cool air brush against my face. The plants had grown fuller, stronger, almost as if they understood what we'd been through together. They had survived the storm with me. My neighbors often stopped by to talk, something that had never happened before. The walls that the HOA had built between us, invisible but real, had started to crumble. One afternoon, a young couple knocked on my door, asking if I could help them start a small vegetable patch of their own. "We've never done this before," they admitted shyly. I smiled and handed them a handful of tomato seeds. "Start here," I said. "It's all about patience." Soon, the quiet neighborhood that once felt like a collection of strangers began to feel alive again. Kids played outside, laughter replaced whispers, and the once sterile yard started showing signs of life. Rows of herbs, patches of flowers, even small fruit trees appeared one by one. It was subtle, but beautiful, like nature reclaiming her space. And every time I walked down the street, I felt proud knowing I'd helped plant those changes. One weekend, the community came together for a small event, an idea Mrs. Lewis had proposed. The Green Day. It was a neighborhood gathering to celebrate local gardens and share homegrown food. Tables lined the street, filled with vegetables, jams, and flowers. The smell of fresh herbs and baked bread filled the air. For the first time in years, the neighborhood wasn't about perfection, it was about connection. As I stood behind my table, offering jars of homemade mint jelly, I caught sight of Mr. Graham across the street. He wasn't wearing his usual stern expression. Instead, he looked tired, hesitant. Eventually, he walked over. For a moment, I thought he might say something sharp, but his tone surprised me. "You've made quite an impression, Mr. Khan," he said quietly. "The board's been reevaluating how we operate." I didn't gloat. I simply nodded. "Change isn't easy," I replied, "but sometimes it's necessary." He gave a faint smile, one that held both humility and defeat. "You were right about one thing," he said. "A community should protect, not punish." Then he walked away. It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough, and I accepted it. As the day went on, children ran through the grass, neighbors traded recipes, and laughter echoed where tension used to live. Sarah looked at me with that same proud smile she'd had the day we left the courthouse. "You know," she said softly, "this neighborhood finally feels like home." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. "Yeah," I whispered, "because now it actually is." Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I stayed behind in the garden. The lanterns from the event still flickered softly, casting warm light across the plants. I walked between the rows, brushing my fingers across the leaves. Each touch carried a memory, of struggle, of courage, of faith. This garden had been my battlefield, but now it was my sanctuary again. I thought about all the people who had messaged me, about the stories they shared, families who had started gardening again, communities standing up to unfair rules, people rediscovering the simple joy of growing something real. My fight had become a spark for others. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about inspiring. That realization filled me with quiet gratitude. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Mrs. Lewis visited again. She handed me a small pot with a single sprouting seed. "It's from my husband's old lemon tree," she said. "I thought you might give it a good home." I smiled, touched by her gesture. "I'll plant it right by the fence," I told her. "That way everyone who passes by can see it grow." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "That's what gardens are for, to remind people that life always finds a way." As I planted the tiny tree that night, I realized how far I'd come, from fear to freedom, from isolation to community. The soil beneath my hands felt familiar, forgiving. I whispered a small prayer of thanks, for the struggle, for the strength it gave me, and for the peace that finally took root. The garden no longer felt like a fight. It felt like a promise, that no matter how rigid or cold the world becomes, there will always be places where life insists on growing. And sometimes, all it takes is one person brave enough to protect that growth. Years have passed since the day I stood in that courtroom, trembling but unbroken. The garden that once sparked so much conflict now stands, as the heart of the neighborhood, a living memory of everything we went through. The wooden beds are filled with vibrant greens, tall sunflowers, and herbs that scent the breeze. It's no longer just my garden. It belongs to everyone who believed in something bigger than fear. Sometimes I still wake early, before the world stirs, and step outside to watch the sunrise spill across the leaves. The soil feels the same beneath my fingers, cool, steady, and alive. Every seed I plant carries a story, a memory of struggle and strength. I've learned that growth isn't only what happens in the ground. It's what happens in us too. The battles we fight quietly shape the person we become. The HOA eventually replaced its leadership. Mr. Graham retired, and a new board took over, one built on cooperation rather than control. They invited me to help write a new section of the community guidelines. Sustainable living and gardening. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same rulebook that once tried to destroy my peace was now protecting it. Life has a way of turning full circle. Our neighborhood transformed in ways I never imagined. Where sterile lawns once stood, flowers now bloom. Children learn how to plant seeds instead of staring at screens. Elderly neighbors share tips about soil and watering. Every yard tells a story, a patch of color, a whisper of independence. The air feels different here now. Lighter. Freer. It's as if the whole community finally remembered what living really means. Sometimes, when I sit under the lemon tree that Mrs. Lewis gave me, I think about my mother. I imagine her smiling, proud of what her lessons became. She taught me that every seed is a promise, not just to grow food, but to grow faith. She used to say, "The earth remembers kindness." And looking at this thriving space, I believe she was right. The earth remembered, and it gave back tenfold. One day, a young girl from down the street came by holding a notebook. "Mr. Khan," she asked shyly, "can I interview you for my school project? It's about people who make a difference." Her words caught me off guard. I smiled and nodded. "Of course," I said. She asked me what lesson I learned from everything that happened. I thought for a moment and replied, "That peace isn't given, it's grown. You have to plant it, protect it, and never let anyone pull it out by the roots." She smiled and wrote down every word. Watching her walk away, I realized something powerful. The fight that once consumed me had become a lesson for others. My story wasn't just about standing up to an HOA anymore. It was about resilience, faith, and the quiet power of doing what's right. That night, as the stars shimmered above the quiet neighborhood, I sat in the garden with Sarah beside me. The world felt still, peaceful. The wind rustled through the lemon leaves, carrying the scent of growth and renewal. "You think people will remember all this?" she asked softly. I looked around at the gardens blooming on every street and smiled. "They already do," I said. "They remember every time something grows." The camera of life doesn't always capture the battles we fight, the letters, the fear, the sleepless nights. But it always captures what we build afterward. I built peace from conflict, beauty from defiance, and community from division. My garden is my proof that even in a world full of rules, life finds its way through cracks in the concrete. And as the moonlight glowed over the rows of lavender and mint, I realized that this wasn't just the end of a story, it was the beginning of a legacy. A reminder to anyone watching or listening: never let fear or authority uproot what gives your soul peace. Because when you fight for something living, something good, it has a way of outlasting everything, even the people who tried to bury it. The soil beneath us never forgets the hands that tended it. And neither will I.